Hello, I'm Rick Harnish, Executive Director of the High Speed Rail Alliance. We really appreciate you coming here today. For those who are unfamiliar with the High Speed Rail Alliance, we're a nonprofit. We're supported by our members, people like you, who wish they could take the train on a regular basis and have it a part of their regular lives. We help simplify the issues, understand why we should do this, what steps can be taken to do it, and help you educate your local leaders in order to get them engaged. The core reason for me for doing this is that the more people are walking when they're in a place, the better that place is. So if you get people there without a car, you end up with much stronger places that are much more lively. People bump into each other, and there's just more life and more economic activity. I ran into an example this past week that I think is kind of apropos today's discussion, where I took the subway to Coney Island and two big trains, probably 1,000 each, pulled into that station at the same time. No congestion in the hallway as people walked from their train, and Coney Island's right there across the street. No big parking lot, no big traffic jam, etc. Unfortunately, we've had decades of focus on let's figure out how to move more and more cars to the detriment. So I'm really excited about our guest today, who's going to talk about that steamroller in Texas and what people are doing to change direction and the impacts of that steamroller. So, Chris, if you could take the introduction, and we're really excited about today's program.
Yes, thank you, Rick, and thank you, Megan Kimble, and thank you all for being here today. We've been working on, these webinars often take months to put together, and this one I think we first started talking about maybe in April. So it's exciting that it's finally here today. And our speaker, Megan Kimble, is a journalist, editor, and the author of two books of nonfiction, most recently City Limits, Infrastructure, Inequality, and the Future of America's Highways, published by Crown this April. The book has drawn some really high praise. Richard Florida, the author of the influential book, The Rise of the Creative Class, wrote, "City Limits is a triumph. Megan Kimble exposes how powerful groups are able to take away people's homes, destroy their neighborhoods, and run roughshod over communities with virtually no accountability." Bill McKibben, the author and environmental leader, wrote, "Nothing could be more heartening than the growing movement, powerfully chronicled in City Limits, to move past this sad stage in our country's development and onto something new that works for people, not cars." Megan Kimble also writes narrative features for national and Texas publications, including the Houston Chronicle, the New York Times, Texas Monthly, and Bloomberg City Lab. We'll need to wrap this talk up today, no later than 5 minutes before the top of the next hour. So for members of our audience, if you have a question, please use Zoom's Q&A feature. That helps us to just organize things and get to as many questions as we can. If you have just a general comment, you can put that in the chat. And with that, Ms. Kimble, please take it away.
Great. Well, I'm so excited to be here to talk to all of y'all. My talk will indeed focus more on highways than rail, but I think the two are very well connected. I'm going to get my presentation up. So indeed, this is my most recent book. It looks at kind of highways across America, and largely the argument I'm making is we spend far too much money on highways, and we could spend the billions and billions of dollars that we spend supporting car infrastructure on other modes of travel. The book mostly looks at urban highways across Texas. So I began reporting this book. I live in Austin, Texas, and in the spring of 2020, as the pandemic was just getting started. It was April. We were all at home, and the Texas Transportation Commission met to allocate $4 billion to expand this stretch of highway called I-35, just less than a mile from where I live, from where I'm talking to you right now. It's a double-decker elevated highway. It goes right through the heart of Austin, right near downtown, right near the University of Texas, through residential neighborhoods. And so I wondered when I heard about this plan, I knew about evidence that showed that when you add capacity to an urban highway, typically that capacity fills up with cars and it doesn't actually fix congestion. And so I started reporting on this massive expansion right in my backyard. And I quickly learned about a highway expansion in Houston called the North Houston Highway Improvement Project, right down the highway from me in Austin. And this is actually an even more massive highway expansion. This is the map of it. It will mostly focus on expanding about 20 miles of Interstate 45 from Houston's downtown to the suburb of Spring, but it will also rebuild and reroute Houston's entire downtown loop. So that includes I-10 and I-69. The cost of this project when I started reporting was $7 billion. It has since blossomed to $11 billion to expand this highway, and that actually does not include the cost of acquiring right-of-way. According to TxDOT's own analysis, 1,200 people live in the footprint of this highway expansion. It will displace 300 businesses and consume 450 acres of land. So it's a massive, massive highway expansion. So the more I sort of looked into these two projects, the more I really started to ask the question, widening urban highways doesn't fix traffic. This has been documented again and again, starting in 1962 when an economist looked at all of these urban interstates that were being built across the country as a result of the Interstate Highway Act, which passed 6 years earlier, and found that on urban commuter expressways, peak hour traffic congestion rises to meet maximum capacity. He called that the fundamental law of urban congestion. And again, researchers have proven this phenomenon that when you add capacity, cars fill that up. At UC Davis, as recently as 2017, a researcher found that when you add 1% of lane capacity, traffic increases by 1%. So it's self-defeating, all of this money we're spending promising to fix traffic. That's exactly what TxDOT has promised the citizens of Texas is we're going to make your commute easier. We're going to make congestion better by adding these lanes. That's why we're going to spend all this public money. But in fact, all the evidence shows that doesn't work. So why are we doing this? That was my fundamental question as a journalist, is what is motivating this? And there are lots of ways to answer that question. To me, I think it's fundamentally a political question. So I'm going to give you
a guy in a wheelchair.
The governor of Texas, this is Governor Greg Abbott. He ran for office in 2014, promising to fix traffic in Texas cities. And here's what he said.
Move faster than traffic on some roads in Texas. I'm Greg Abbott, and my plan adds billions for new road construction without raising taxes, fees, or tolls. We pay for it by ensuring that money dedicated for roads will be spent only on roads. And no more taking highway funds by the legislature to pay for their pet projects. Elect me, and I'll get Texas moving.
It is an actual highway in Dallas, by the way, where that ad was filmed. So Greg Abbott was indeed elected, and he delivered on his campaign promise. Under his leadership, the Texans considered 2 propositions, which changed the state constitution to allocate some portion of revenue from the oil and gas industry, as well as our sales tax, to the Highway Trust Fund, our state highway trust fund. And when voters approved it, they approved that funding would only be used for the construction of right-of-way. The project he referenced in that ad was a light rail, or excuse me, a trolley project in El Paso, which was very controversial in the legislature, and it sort of soured a lot of people on funding public transit in the state. And so under Greg Abbott and under these 2 funding streams, the state of Texas, under this program called Texas Clear Lanes, has committed nearly $70 billion over the next decade to widen highways in 5 major metro areas. And I think it's worth mentioning that, this dynamic has happened, which I'm sure many of you have kind of witnessed in your work, is that the funding for highways versus transit has become an incredibly politicized fight. That, I've been in the state legislature as lawmakers were considering opening up the State Highway Trust Fund to fund more transit projects in Texas cities. And people testify, and lawmakers agree, that kind of transit is quote unquote for socialists, whereas roads enable free market capitalism. We're subsidizing transit in urban areas, whereas the roads pay for themselves through the gas tax, through user fees. And I think that is lots of ways to disprove that. That is demonstrably false. That the Highway Trust Fund nationally has been subsidized by general taxpayers since at least 2008. So we are subsidizing transportation of all modes, but I think there's this ideology that transit is much more kind of a socialized, subsidized form of transit today. But that is very much a new political phenomenon. That has not always been the case. The funding for roads has not always been quite so political. So many of you might know that our interstate highways most of them originated with President Eisenhower in 1956. He passed the Interstate Highway Act, which allocated $25 billion to build the Interstate Highway Program. And Eisenhower sold this program to Congress as a way to connect the country. So he was very much focused on highways between cities as a way to move munitions and foster trade. So it was a jobs program. It was going to help, connect this vast country and build economic prosperity along the way. So under this program, the federal government agreed to pay 90% of the cost of construction of these highways. Previously, it had been only paying 50% of the cost of construction. So a lot of money started flowing to states, essentially with no strings attached. And so those states saw that influx of public money. Cars were rushing city streets. Car registrations nearly doubled over the previous 2 decades. And urban planners and state officials said, hey, all of this money is coming from the federal government. We're going to start building highways through the middle of our cities. And as a result, the program began to run significantly over budget. So the federal government was on the hook to pay for all of these highways. And Eisenhower appointed this guy, General John S. Bragdon, who's one of my favorite historical figures I found reporting the book. I think he kind of looks like Mr. Rogers. But he's an engineer. The two met in the Army, and Bragdon had overseen construction for the U.S. military for several decades before this appointment. Eisenhower appointed Bragdon to oversee the implementation of the Interstate Highway Program. And Bragdon reported to Eisenhower that urban highways were consuming a disproportionate share of the federal money, 44%, while accounting for only 10% of the mileage. And so Eisenhower, recognizing this as a problem, asked Bragdon to look into the matter, to ask Congress to investigate it in the Department of Commerce, which oversaw the Bureau of Public Roads. Was Congress's intent to use federal money to build urban highways, or was its intent to focus on these connections between cities? So Bragdon spent a year investigating this. He asked Congress to look into it. Congress produced a report that Bragdon kind of synthesized into this interim report, which he presented to Eisenhower in the spring of 1960. And it's really a remarkable document that I think will be very familiar to a lot of the urbanists of today. The language that he uses. Again, this is a Republican. This is an engineer. It's very much a question of geometry in cities. Practically all the experts on the transportation problem of cities agree that rapid transit and mass transit systems are the solution for urban peak hour congestion. We do not believe the internet system is the solution for solving rush hour traffic. So he says this. And in the report, he documents how rather than spending money to build out this mass transit system, cities were actually using federal money to tear up, rail lines and bus routes to build highways. So rather than actually encouraging transit, cities and states had dedicated that money to bulldoze a lot of the existing rail lines in cities and in favor of highways. So he presents this to Eisenhower and he says, you should direct the Bureau of Public Roads to basically put parameters on federal money, that the Bureau of Public Roads should not be sending money to states to build these urban highways. Instead, states should focus on building connections between cities, the highway that connects Austin to Houston. That's the kind of thing that we want. And Eisenhower responded to this presentation, which is captured in this memorandum published a few days later, that the matter of running interstate routes through the congested part of cities was entirely against his original concept and wishes. He had never anticipated that the program he sponsored would turn out that way, and that he was dissatisfied with this implementation. So what happened? Well, that is actually captured in Eisenhower's secretary's diary, which I found when I went to the Eisenhower Presidential Library when I was reporting the book. And she writes that, these generals are in for a study of the roads program. Bragdon thinks that the Bureau of Public Roads should change course, but it's an election year. And so this money has been committed to states, and Eisenhower says, quote, the states would rise up in arms if new direction was given. So as a way to sort of preserve his party's interest, Eisenhower takes no action. So I think probably most of you know what happened. This is a picture of a neighborhood in Houston called the Fifth Ward. It's a historically Black neighborhood. It was redlined by the federal government in the 1940s, meaning that it was shaded red on federal appraisal maps, and residents who lived there were denied access to any form of government-backed financing. So it was just disinvested as a matter of policy. But I talked to people who grew up there in the 50s and 60s, and it was this complete community. People didn't have cars. They walked everywhere they needed to go. There was a central business district. There was, several schools, really prominent Black high school called Phyllis Wheatley High School. No one locked their doors. Everybody knew everyone. And then the highways were built. And this is what that same intersection looks like today. So in just the Fifth Ward alone, Interstate 10 demolished 1,200 structures. So it really split this community in half. I talked to one woman whose family had to move when she was a teenager. She was just starting 9th grade, and she really wanted to graduate from Phyllis Wheatley High School because it was a prominent, well-known Black high school. And so after her family was displaced, she walked every single day 3 miles one way back to school. Fast forward to today, we have built all of these highways through the middle of our cities, and the consequence is not just racial segregation and displacement, it is also emissions. So nationally, greenhouse gas emissions account for 1/3 of all emissions in the US, so the largest percentage by sector of emissions. And Texas is really the elephant in the room. This is from a TxDOT report in 2018 that found that Texas on-road emissions account for 0.5% of total worldwide carbon dioxide emissions. So the highway expansions that I look at in my book and the resistance to those highway expansions have a measurable impact on Texas's emissions, but also global worldwide emissions. You know, what we do with highways will impact whether or not the state and the country meets its climate goals. This is a chart from the Georgetown Climate Center that looked at state investments from the IIJA, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Bill. How states choose to allocate that funding has a measurable impact on our greenhouse gas goals. So the red lines are if we continue sort of business as usual with highway expansion, and the green lines are if states shift that funding to mode shift, to encouraging EV adoption, to all the other forms of travel that we might encourage. And Texas is the one on the right. We have the largest range of possible outcomes dependent on our transportation investments. And I think it's sort of worth restating that the report found that minimizing further highway expansion was the most important lever to avoid putting upward pressure on transportation emissions. And the way you minimize highway expansion is that you shift funding to transit. This is another kind of wonky graph by a nonprofit called Transportation for America, and found that despite the Biden administration's commitment to sustainability, most of the IIJA funding is going to highway expansion or resurfacing. But there is a growing movement to resist highway expansion, to resist this form of development. And largely it's become a climate fight. I think young people across the country are realizing that transportation is one of the areas that largely has been ignored as a contributor to climate change, and are really trying to stop these highway expansions as a way to fight for a more livable future as it relates to the environment. So I went to Cincinnati a year and a half ago, to document the first national gathering of freeway fighters across the country. So there are grassroots campaigns in almost every city that you can think of, cities that you might not think have robust opposition. And they came together to really talk about how do you fight a state DOT. State DOTs are very well resourced, and they have the time and money to kind of wear out citizen opposition. And so my book really focuses on the freeway fighters in Texas, the people who see the massive highway expansions that TxDOT has planned, and the impacts of those expansions on displacement, on the environment, on flooding, and saying, hey, no, we don't want this. So this is a picture of Molly Cook and Susan Graham, who founded a nonprofit group called Stop TxDOT I-45. And they're nurses. They saw this highway expansion. They knew what it would do to Houston's air pollution. They saw the impacts of bad air quality on the populations that they served at their respective hospitals. And they said, hey, we don't want this. We're going to start fighting this. So they organized volunteers to go door to door in neighborhoods impacted by the highway expansion. Many of the people who would be displaced eventually by this highway had no idea. Homeowners and renters alike had no idea that their homes were going to get taken for this highway. And so what Stop TxDOT I-45 did very effectively is mobilize those people to resist expansion. I will note Molly Cook is actually now a state senator in Texas. She got involved with organizing because of this highway expansion, and then decided to run for office and ran a really effective grassroots campaign, and she's now in the state Senate. So there's one freeway fighter elected official in Texas. These are two more examples of folks who will be impacted by this expansion in Houston. The woman on the right is Modesty Cooper. She's at my book launch in Houston. She came, and she is a woman in her 30s. She served as a civilian for the US military, and she bought a parcel of land in the Fifth Ward really close to that image I showed earlier, that intersection of homes and highway. and decided to build herself a new house from the ground up. She hired a contractor, she designed her home, she made this home exactly to the specifications that she wanted. And she moved back home from Iraq to Houston in 2019 to move her possessions into her new home. And in her mailbox was a letter from the Texas Department of Transportation saying, hey, actually, we need this home. We need your home and the land it's on to expand this highway that runs right in front of it. And Modesty said, no, thank you. She knew that the 1,200 homes that would be displaced by this highway or would be demolished were largely occupied by people like her, people who were Black or Hispanic who had been impacted by highway construction in the past. And she filed a civil rights complaint saying this project is illegal because it violates protections that I have under the Civil Rights Act. And the Federal Highway Administration got her letter and letters from others and paused the project for 2 years while they investigated these quote unquote serious civil rights complaints. Which at the time was an unprecedented move. This is a, $10 billion project that the feds said, hey, we need to stop to investigate what you're doing. And that action was the result of activism, of people like Molly and Susan going door to door, people like Modesty who stood up for their rights. The group in Houston organized this protest outside of a complex called Lost at the Ballpark. It's in the footprint of the expansion right next to downtown Houston. It's just east of downtown, and it's right along a transit line. So it's the kind of housing cities are trying to build, is transit-connected housing. Well, there are 3 buildings, and the front one is in the right-of-way of the highway expansion. A volunteer with Stop TxDOT I-45 was going to work one day on the transit line and saw construction fencing around all 3 buildings. And he looked into the environmental documentation for this project and found that TxDOT had only accounted for the front building when it documented its loss of housing and hadn't included the units in the back 2 building, which were hundreds of units more of housing. So they staged a protest and said, hey, TxDOT, you can't take more than what you accounted for legally under the National Environmental Policy Act. They got the mayor involved, they got the Federal Highway Administration paying attention. And as a result of this protest right here, TxDOT agreed to keep the back 2 buildings and sell them to, or I don't know exactly the arrangement, but they're currently in the process of becoming permanent supportive housing for people exiting homelessness. Freeway fighters in Texas have gone to the Texas Transportation Commission, which is the commission appointed by Governor Abbott to oversee TxDOT. And they have, gone and protested. They've gone to give public testimony to say, we don't want more highways. We want bike lanes. We want buses. We want different modes of travel. And we want you to spend some of your $100 billion 10-year budget investing in those things. They have made those protests really visible in cities. I think what is hard for activism around highway expansion and particularly even journalism around it is that a lot of these highway expansions for decades, for 10 years, will just exist as a PDF. There's an environmental impact statement. There's a draft environmental impact statement. It's an 8,000-page document. It's very wonky and inaccessible. You have to study right-of-way maps to really understand the impacts on a city. And these activists studied those maps and went out into their cities and said, hey, here's where TxDOT wants to put a highway. This is a cafe in Austin on the left that activists drew like a piece of tape over the highway and into the street behind it to say, all of this will soon be highway. One of the buildings that's in the footprint of the expansion in Austin is Escuelita del Alma, which is a Spanish immersion preschool. Austin, like most cities in the US, has a childcare shortage. There are not enough providers for all the parents who need childcare. And the owners of this preschool were not sure that they would be able to continue their business. They got a very affordable rate to lease this property, and they weren't sure that they could afford to stay in Austin and continue serving the families that they wanted to serve. I went and spent a day at the preschool when I was reporting the book, and the class that I hung out with was studying modes of travel. And I just include this picture because all the kids either wanted to travel by school bus or fire engine. So the conclusion of the book, the argument of the book is rather than spending $70 billion like we are in the state of Texas to expand these highways, we should actually remove them and allocate that money to urban transit and put that land to housing or other forms of community development. So I went to Rochester, New York, which removed a stretch of its Inner Loop Highway in 2017. So this is, on the left is a picture of the Inner Loop North, which actually the city is moving forward with removing currently, but it still exists. It's a sunken highway. It divides downtown from neighborhoods adjacent to it. And in 2017, the city got a grant from the Obama administration to fill in a stretch of what's called the Inner Loop East. So on the right, that's a picture of what used to be a sunken highway. They brought that highway up to grade. The surplus land was sold to developers. So there are now 3- and 4-story apartment complexes on that land. Half of those units, I think there's been more than 1,000 units created, are rented to families earning below the median income. And it's really remarkable to like walk around the city in a place that used to have this moat separating it and to just feel like, one neighborhood is contiguous with another. So the final highway that I profile in my book is I-345, which is a stretch of highway in Dallas. It's an elevated stretch of highway. And for about a decade, an urban planner there named Patrick Kennedy has been advocating to remove this stretch of highway. You can see that it's an elevated highway. It's surrounded by like surface parking and public storage, which is land in the heart of downtown Dallas, the 9th most populous city in the country. A lot of that land is depressed by the presence of this highway because people don't want to recreate or live right next to an elevated highway. And so Patrick started kind of asking the question of anyone who would listen, what if we just tore this highway down? What if we removed it and put that land to better use? And he and others commissioned a study that in 2021 found that removing I-345 would sort of liberate or otherwise allow developers to build on 377 acres of land. That's an enormous amount of land in the middle of downtown Dallas, very valuable land, $9 billion worth of development potential that could create $255 million in property tax revenue for the city. So, I think that what that reveals is like the opportunity cost that these highways represent, that this is very valuable land that not only could be put to more productive use, but could enter the city's property tax rolls. And the cost of removing highways is much smaller than I think people assume. A lot of the conversation around highway removal and indeed highway expansion is about congestion delay. So how long is it going to take me to get where I'm going if you don't widen this highway? How long will it take me to get to work if you do remove it? And TxDOT actually Patrick got TxDOT to consider removing I-345. And they did this big study in 2016 called CityMap that looked at I-345 in the context of all the highways in Dallas and found that removing that stretch of highway would create 3 minutes of delay for the average commuter. A more global study of more than 100 projects that reduced road capacity found that traffic went down, even controlling for traffic on parallel routes by 25%. So just as induced demand is a phenomenon that has been well understood for 70 years, which is to say, when you make it easier for people to drive, more people will drive. When you make it harder for people to drive, by whatever means, when you constrain capacity of driving, people will make other choices. And that doesn't necessarily mean that your economy will collapse. People will simply take fewer discretionary trips. They will make different choices about where to live and work. They will make different choices about the mode that they travel by. And I think that like this phenomenon of reduced demand, I think is less well understood than induced demand. So finally, I will just leave you with some hope, which is to say, I think the tide is turning across the country. States and cities are recognizing the cost of highway construction. They are facing much more organized opposition, and they are choosing to spend their money differently. Colorado, I wrote a story for the New York Times. Colorado elected Jared Polis, a Democrat who really made climate a priority, and he directed every state agency to make a plan to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 90% by 2050. Well, the Colorado Department of Transportation, legally required to adhere to that plan, looked at their portfolio and said, hey, we cannot actually widen all the highways we plan to widen and meet those targets. So they canceled 2 major expansions, one of them I-25, which goes right through the heart of Denver. Los Angeles, similarly facing opposition mostly from neighborhood groups who didn't want more air pollution. A Hispanic neighborhood who already had some of the highest rates of asthma in the state fought the expansion of 710 for years. And won. And so the Metropolitan Planning Organization of LA reallocated some of the money that was going to go to that expansion to transit and active transportation. So I think that also demonstrates that the money we spend on highways could be spent on something else. Most American cities like Austin, where I live, don't have very good public transportation. It's very hard for me to take public transportation here. And that's because we're spending all of our transportation money on highways. And that is a policy choice. That could be changed. What is required is the political will. So I'm going to end there and open up for questions.
Thank you very much. This was very helpful. My first question is kind of an update. So Am I right that the Austin MPO recently had a vote on the widening and the suburbs outvoted the city? How did that go? And can you tell me more?
Yeah, so a lot of these, I'm sure a lot of folks on the call are familiar with metropolitan planning organizations, but they are the kind of local regional planning body that approves federal funding for projects like a highway expansion. Largely, they're dominated by suburban interests. So the way that their voting representation works is more like the Senate, where populous urban counties or urban city areas are often outvoted by suburban interests. And suburbs historically really want highways because people tend to drive back to the city for their work or school. So Austin is no different. The city of Austin has long actually opposed this highway expansion. But the suburban counties around it really want it. And so it was actually kind of a remarkable vote at some point this spring, I can't remember, where most of Austin's delegation to CAMPO, which is the Metropolitan Planning Organization here, voted against the expansion. And that I think represents a sort of a shift that political leaders are more willing to take a stand saying, we don't want these expansions. For a very long time, they were just sort of, who would oppose more transportation funding, right? Like no political leader would do that. But I think that speaks to not only how there's a growing recognition that this is a climate issue, that Austin cannot meet its climate goals and widen this highway, but there's been real grassroots opposition asking political leaders to do something different.
So now, if I understand right, I think it was in Austin where, because of the way the highway dislocations worked and the housing segregation worked, you've got most of your workers in the South and most of the jobs in the North. And I'm right about that, right?
In Dallas?
Was it Dallas or Austin?
In Dallas, yeah. That's kind of the dynamic of Dallas is, I mean, most of the dynamic in most American cities, this like segregation has created the patterns of development. And Dallas is no exception, but like South Dallas tends to be where a lot of lower income people live, and a lot of the job growth has been in North Dallas. So most people in South Dallas commute north to go to work.
So you've got this problem of, if at least in people's minds, and it's probably true in the short term, if you reduce capacity on the north-south system, then those folks can't get to their jobs. In the long term, it would be better to have the people closer to their jobs. But how do you I'm not sure you have the answer to this, but one of my questions is, well, how do you make that transition so that, because you, in essence, have to take the highway capacity out and put transit in to make that shift happen, but you can't do it if people don't recognize that it has to happen?
Yeah, I mean, so I went to public meetings. So TxDOT actually considered removing I-345 as like a formal project alternative in 2021. And so I went up to Dallas to those public meetings to talk to people about what they thought about that. And I talked to folks in South Dallas who are predominantly Black, who said, that's insulting to think that you might take away our access to jobs. Like, you segregated us here, you city of Dallas, 50 years ago, and now we have to drive to get to our jobs. Like, do not take away that access. So there was real opposition from people in those neighborhoods to the highway removal that I talked to. But I think so I'm like absolutely empathetic to the like short-term pain of sort of constraining, or the perceived constraint of access. But when you sort of look into it, I only talk to like a handful of people. Not everyone from South Dallas comes to those meetings. And 25% of households in South Dallas do not own a car. So there's a huge percentage of people who are actually not served by a highway, that actually would be much better served by having a really robust transit system, like a bus line that comes every 5 minutes instead of every 20, to get them to their job. So I think it's like, a lot of people have sort of, particularly in Texas, believe that the only way to access opportunity is in a car. But there are lots of other cities that prove that that's like not true. And I think it's a matter of public education, of showing how expensive car ownership is. It's really, for the average household in South Dallas, they're spending a huge proportion of their disposable income on transportation. And all of the research shows that like car dependency is incredibly punishing for low-income households, and that having access to transit is much more affordable. So it's like having those conversations, I think, like, but there's no like public leader who's willing to do that. Like, that's not my job as a journalist, but like, I think what I see is people sort of assume that without a car, I can't get anywhere, which is the result of policy decisions. It's the result of how we've invested our money.
Yeah, so in most places it is in fact true. You can't get there without a car, but that's not the way it should be.
Right.
Right.
And then it would be more equitable and affordable to have another form of transportation system. But I absolutely empathize with folks who are like, I need to get to work tomorrow. Like, I have to pay my bills this month.
So this might be outside of your expertise, but I'm really curious about your views on Governor Hochul's killing of congestion pricing in New York. Do you have a view on that, or you know?
Yeah, actually, I did a book talk in New York City, and I landed like the morning she had that press conference to announce that she was killing congestion pricing. Yeah, I think it's bad policy. I think congestion pricing was good policy. To vastly oversimplify. I mean, I think, like, I used to have a slide in my presentation that actually, I can't remember off the top of my head, but Governor Hochul had this quote that she said in her press conference announcing that congestion pricing was not going to move forward, reminded me so much of things that Governor Abbott says, which basically are, if we implement this policy, if we implement congestion pricing, we are going to restrict New Yorkers' access to opportunity and jobs. And that's exactly what Abbott says, is he says, our investments in transportation infrastructure, which is to say our investments in roads, keeps us #1 in the nation for economic development. So there is this belief among Democrats and Republicans that enabling car travel supports economic prosperity. And that's the argument that Hochul made, is that making it more expensive for drivers is going to hurt our city by constraining sort of economic activity. People aren't going to come to our city and spend their money. And I think that that's such a short-sighted, easily disprovable argument that, like, in fact, you can build lots of prosperity by building really robust transit that makes land values it increases land values and increases people's access to commerce. People are spending less money on transportation, so they have more disposable income to spend on other things. There's so many different ways to disprove that, the idea that car travel creates economic prosperity. But I think, like, I see politicians of both parties continuing to make that argument. So, like, what I heard when I watched that press conference was just like, oh, she sounds like my governor. And I think it's like I think that's a fallacy. And the idea that driving should be free is like something that we has been sort of ingrained in us since the interstate highway era, that like roads are a public good and that they should be free to use and access. And in fact, like, we actually subsidize roads to an enormous degree in this country, and beginning to shift some of that subsidy to transit is appropriate if you want to, meet other goals like climate goals or, economic development goals, whatever they are.
So how do you think, based on what you've read, how do you think this idea that highways are part of capitalism, when in fact they're a big socialist program, how do you think that this idea that highways pay for themselves with user fees became such a persistent myth?
Well, that's how it was sold. I mean, that was Eisenhower's promise for the Interstate Highway Program, was that the highways would pay for themselves through user fees. And they did. I mean, a lot of the Interstate Highway system was built out using the gas tax. So in lots of ways, that was a user-funded system. Drivers paid taxes on their gasoline, which went to pay for the roads those drivers used. But like that has been, it's like a very outdated belief. The Highway Trust Fund has been insolvent for a long time, and we subsidize it. So I think the origins are the origins of the program. But that and just how roads are funded generally is through the gas taxes. There's this belief that it's user funded, whereas transit people pay fares, and that's somehow, and typically fares do not cover the cost of a transit system, and that difference is much more visible in transit, right? Like, you can look at a transit system like DART, and I don't know what it is, but like fares are some small percentage of their overall operating budget. In New York, it's much higher because they have much more robust ridership, but you can measure that difference much easier. And I think with roads, it's like people forget that, every 7 years we pass a bill that has this massive influx of cash to state highway agencies.
Massive is the word. So Susan asked a question. Bill Kling, who appears to be somebody from Houston, are you familiar with Bill King? And she's asking, he sent out an email today claiming that mass transit has little impact on emissions. I imagine, just doing a quick Google search, that he's a major player on the Let's Build More Highways side.
So sorry, he was advocating that transit has what on emissions?
Little impact. So Bill Kling sent out an email today claiming that mass transit has little impact on emissions based on an EPA report.
Like, you mean moving to mass transit?
Yeah.
I mean, that mass transit has little impact on emissions, which is to say every rider of mass transit emits much less than every driver. So I don't think that's what he's saying, though. I mean, I think, that's just false. Like, there's so many different ways the EPA has put out lots of reports that show that, like, taking the bus or riding a train is more than 90% fewer emissions per person than driving a car. So I don't know where he gets his data. I'd be happy to have a conversation with him.
Excellent. Chris, were there any more questions?
Yeah, there are several. And I just, Megan, since you've been talking, you may not have seen in the chat just all the praise for your presentation and your book as well. So thank you again for doing this. First question from the audience. Rick did one already from Susan, but next one. If someone happens to work for an engineering consulting firm whose main clients are DOTs and their highway projects, do you have advice on how to fight against highway projects without a conflict of interest occurring?
Yeah, that's a hard question. I think a thing I learned reporting the book is a lot of people, even in local news coverage of these highway expansions, is that people point to TxDOT. Like, TxDOT is the villain in this world, or your state DOT is the villain because they are coming to your door saying we need your home for this highway expansion. But TxDOT is answering to the state legislature and the governor. So like mostly this is a political fight, that state DOTs will do what their legislatures tell them. That many people, even at TxDOT, like I have talked to I won't say them by name, but former very high up people at TxDOT who absolutely know that building roads does not fix congestion, who absolutely know that the billions of dollars they're spending is making, creating worse outcomes for Texans. But they can't do anything. If they were to say, we're not going to widen I-35, our governor would fire the executive director. So like, I think, I don't know how to create change from within an engineering firm or, folks who work on these projects, but I think it is like paying much more attention to your state legislature. So I don't know the rules for the specific person's job, but like in Texas, every session, there's a bill that says, let's open up our state highway trust fund to transit. And it always never makes it out of committee. But like, what are political pressure points to advance bills like that? In every state, Colorado is a great example of a state DOT responding to political direction from its legislature. So that's my opinion, is just really a lot of this change, I think, because also, like, the federal government largely just passes through funding to states. So states, I had a source tell me states are the emperors. Like, the federal government is just the bank. Most of the money that goes to state DOTs is formula funding. So really the locus of change for transportation funding is in state legislatures. So that's my advice, is just like pay attention to your state legislature.
Okay, thank you. Frank says developers and land investors drive a lot of infrastructure decisions. Unfortunately, single-family suburban housing has become a really affordable option. Isn't freeway expansion partly driven by that suburban land development pressures as a result of cheaper land for housing development?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, historically, for decades, that you get like real estate interests are a huge engine, for lack of a better word, behind highway expansion. They give money to politicians to advance highway expansion because there's lots of money to be made in turning, greenfields into houses. And Houston is the prime example of that. Like a lot of those highway expansions are lobbied for by developers. The Grand Parkway is the classic example of that, which I have not really reported on the corruption behind that highway, so I shouldn't speak too specifically, but it's a loop. It's like the loop to end all loops. I think it traverses, I don't remember, it's hundreds of miles, traverses like 7 counties surrounding Houston. And that was built to open up areas for development. Like that was the explicit reason given to the public. So it's absolutely true that real estate drives highway expansion. In the creation of highways, there's the J.B. Jackson quote, like development follows roads. I had another point. But I think that like what is often missed, like one of my favorite stats that I found for my book is like, so Houston is often held up as this example of a city that has very affordable housing. And indeed it does. They don't have zoning. So like they have lots of townhomes. It's like, it's really easy to build housing there, which is great. They have lots of supply. But one reason it's affordable to buy a single family home is that they've spent so much money on roads, and people pay for that. Like people often don't factor in the cost of transportation to their housing budget. But when you combine housing and transportation, the average household in Houston spends about 20% of their disposable income on transportation. So when you combine those two metrics, Houston is more expensive to live in than New York City. Most people in New York City takes transit and they spend 9% of their disposable income on transportation. So like, indeed, highway expansion is often sold as a way to make homes more affordable, but it's like you also have to factor in the cost of a car and gas and transportation.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to slip this one in because it was sort of related to part of what you just said. Tom asks, do we know how much money the highway lobby contributes to Governor Abbott and others in Texas?
Yeah. I reported that in 2021 for a story that I wrote for the Texas Observer, which got me going on this topic. I don't remember it off the top of my head. I could pull up that story real quick, but it's millions of dollars. The people to look for are like the big highway contractors. So there's one in Houston called Williams Brothers Construction, and they built the Katy Freeway, which is like the most famous example of induced demand in the world. That highway was expanded to 26 lanes and traffic got worse. Williams Brothers Construction is owned by Doug Pitcock, and he and the company have donated millions of dollars to Abbott. There's a group called the Associated General Contractors, and they represent a lot of the concrete companies and highway builders. They donate hundreds of thousands of dollars, not just to Abbott, but to the lieutenant governor and the chair of the Senate Transportation Committee. So that's in that. All of those numbers are in the story I wrote. The Texas Tribune has also done good reporting on that. I don't remember them off the top of my head, but it's lots of money.
Okay. And let's see, we also had a question. What was the role or stance of the North Central Texas Council of Governments in the I-35 project that you mentioned?
The North Central Texas Council of Governments oversees the Dallas-Fort Worth region, so they don't have any jurisdiction over I-35. They are largely road expansion happy. So they opposed the removal of I-345. And like most MPOs, so the MPO in Houston was very much behind the I-45 expansion there, despite the opposition of city officials like the city mayor and the Harris County judge. So what you see in all three cities, in Austin, Dallas, and Houston, is that city officials typically have come out against these highway expansions, and the folks who serve suburban and rural areas want them. And even though they represent a much smaller share of the population, they have a higher voting representation.
Okay. Next question. Most state DOTs, not just in Texas, are rebranded highway departments. Are our energies best spent on leveraging advocacy through Congress or the state level if we hope to create meaningful change? How do we advocate for a balanced transportation system?
Yeah, I think state, like I said, is the real, states are the locus of power. Certainly Congress could write a better surface transportation reauthorization bill, which happened, that's the IIJA. It's a version of the surface transportation reauthorization. So there was a fight when Biden was pushing his, so-called bipartisan infrastructure bill to get more federal funding allocated to transit. It's currently split and has been since the Reagan administration among about an 80-20 split. So 80% of federal funding goes to highway programs, 20% goes to transit. And there was a bill filed that didn't go anywhere, but in kind of a campaign to get Congress to do at least a 50-50 split. So I don't know how to advise people how to lobby Congress, but that is, the next time that bill comes up, that is a huge opportunity to change the transportation system. I think in the meantime, and even after that next bill passes, states have a huge amount of power because most of the federal money flows directly to them with almost no strings attached. So I think the difference of outcomes of a place like Colorado versus Texas, or even California and Texas, California is a very sprawling state, just like Texas. It has a lot of land. A lot of the cities have been built around the automobile. But California its state has committed to much more ambitious climate goals. And as a result, the DOT functions differently. So like Colorado is another good example of like a state has committed to different outcomes like air pollution and emissions. And as a result, they invest more money in transit. So I think getting involved at the state level is maybe more where activists can have an impact.
Okay, thanks. Frank asks, is or could the long-term cost of highway maintenance and repair be factored into highway expansion decisions, since more and bigger highways will require greater future expenditures?
Yeah, they could be. They should be. But they aren't. Is about all I have to say.
Okay. We'll do a final couple of questions here so that we make sure to wrap up a little early. They're both about other organizations, and so I have a slight confession to make. Megan, while you were talking and when you mentioned Freeway Fighters, I went to their site to look up, or to sign up rather, for their newsletter. Their email newsletter, and it had one of those verify that you're a human being things, and the test rather that I had to pass was to click the squares that had cars in them. I thought that was funny. But Jeff asks, are there national and or Midwest regional grassroots organizations lobbying to deconstruct highways and promote mass transit, in addition, I assume, to Freeway Fighters?
Yeah, so Freeway Fighters is like a kind of conglomerate of grassroots groups. So I would encourage everyone to go. I think it's freewayfighters.org, but just Google National Freeway Fighters and you'll find it. It's like I can't remember, it might be through America Walks, I think is the overarching. CNU has also done really great work in moving this campaign forward. But anyway, the Freeway Fighters website has a map of all the active campaigns in the country. So grassroots campaigns that are either resisting expansion or calling for removal. And there are lots in the Midwest. So I don't know them off the top of my head, but I would recommend, let's see if I can just pull it up real quick.
While you're doing that, here's one last question that's related. Theo asks, do the anti-highway expansion groups in Texas have strong connections to national groups, or do they mostly do their work independently?
Work. Yeah. Sorry, I'm bad at multitasking. What was the question again?
No problem. Theo asked, do the anti-highway expansion groups in Texas have strong connections to the national groups, or are they working pretty independently?
I think so. I mean, that's a question for them, but like the groups in Houston, Stop Textile I-45, and there's one in Austin called Rethink 35. They both went to this national convening that I covered for Bloomberg. So they're absolutely in conversation with people across the country. And I think that's what's sort of powerful about this moment in organizing is that for like largely these groups were, I think until recently, these groups were kind of operating in isolation. Like the group in Houston was fighting the highway expansion in Houston, and the group in Austin was fighting the highway expansion in Austin. And those groups started talking to each other, realizing it was the same state agency they were fighting. And then they realized, oh, there are other groups like in Portland, like in New York, that we could talk to about strategies around organizing, combined fundraising efforts. There's been I think a movement to file lawsuits challenging some of these projects. Are there shared legal resources? So indeed, these groups are really like coordinating in a very new way, like I think within the past few years. And that's a lot of what I kind of cover in the book too, is like a more coordinated national movement.
All right. Well, it's 5 minutes before the hour. Let's wrap up. Thank you so much. Rick, any or Megan, any final thoughts?
No, thank you. This was fun. Thanks so much for everyone for coming.
Yes, and again, I also thank everyone for coming, and Megan, I really appreciate you taking the time. And as I mentioned earlier, reading the book made me very angry, but I got through it, and it was a very valuable book. And so I really appreciate you doing it. And thank you again for being here.
Yeah, and buy the book.
And buy the book, exactly.
Someone in the chat says they'll be buying it.
Excellent. Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thanks.